It's the purple that have signs now. Oh my.
All I can take is Tylenol and can't take any NSAIDs. Yeah, after, and I take Labor.
There's nobody to get out in this world.
Pretty good.
All right, we're going to begin. Good morning. Schwell, doing swell. Feeling a whole lot better this week. Glad to see some of us feeling better as well. There are some who are not feeling well. There's an obvious gap in here. But nonetheless, good to see everybody this morning who is with us. We are going to be getting a new study today. I just wanted to say that before we get into our prayer request. If you've not picked up a book, we've got some of the new books here on the front row if you'd like to pick one of those up. And I'm going to be doing something different with this study. I'll talk more about that after we have our opening prayer. Prayer request. What's going on in life? What's new? Is there any updates that we need? Or
our friend Randy Maddox up the road had to have prostate removal.
What's his name?
And during that, his kidneys shut down.
Oh.
So they had him in ICU, and she sent out a prayer request to all knowing. And after a day, his kidneys started functioning again. The next day, he came home. Randy Maddox, Maddox.
He's an EMT around here?
Yeah, he's an EMT.
Does he live on your street?
Yeah.
I know Maddox.
He's Eddie, there's...
Well, I mean, Calvin's son, Jaden, one of his friends' last name is Maddox, and they live in Kingsport. There might be a connection.
Could be.
Interesting.
But anyhow, he's doing much better.
Good. Do you know his address? Or can you give me his address? That's a better question.
I might be able to. Hold on.
Okay. Just sometime today. Doesn't have to be immediately. Okay, so keep Randy Maddox in your prayer. Hopefully his kidneys continue going and that episode doesn't happen again.
He's a very nice man.
432 Prices Grove Road, 37857.
Okay, thank you. Oh, with that said, there is an actual updated compassion card list. It will be available at the beginning of the PM service, though, just so we can add whatever names we need to add this morning. Okay, thank you for that. Anybody else we need to add?
Jackie's not feeling
Yeah,
very good.
Jackie's
But
not.
she's hoping she'll go well enough to come see.
It's a fibromyalgia accident.
Okay. So pray for Jackie. Okay, anyone else? Okay, we'll ask Jacob if he will say a prayer for both Randy and Jackie, and also those who are on our sick list. So Kinsley, the Hurst family, the Saunders family, some of the ones we've mentioned in past services, and also for preparing our minds for Bible class. Thank you. Okay, so like was stated a few moments ago, we are beginning a new study. We're going through the one chapter books of the Bible, so we're going to be going through Obadiah, Philemon, Second John, Third John, and the book of Jude. This is a very interesting study, the way that the book has laid it out, and I'm going to try to make this a little bit more applicable with the book. I'm a firm believer if we invest in something, it is worth sticking to. Otherwise, we're not going to waste the finances of the church. So in this study, I'm actually going to incorporate more of quotes that are found in the book, statements that are found in the book, and how that can guide our study, and how we can even look beyond the lessons in the book for the main focus of this entire section. And that'll make more sense whenever we get to the first part. When we begin this study, we're obviously beginning with the book of Obadiah. We're going to be beginning with conflict is the concept. In fact, this whole study focuses around the idea of conflict. If you look at the beginning on page 2, it talks about this idea of conflict. It's a couple of sentences down. And it would say that conflict sometimes arises because of our own bad decisions. In other instances, they exist through no fault of our own. Now, what's beautiful about conflict is that God is not just the God who knows there's conflict. But if you consider the opposite of conflict, praise be to God that there's such thing called resolution, resolve, peace, an end to the conflict. That's a wonderful thing. In fact, the book of Romans we find in chapter 12, in as much as possible, as much as depends on you, get rid of that word as. It depends on you. If it were up to you to save all of mankind, can you get along with other people enough to save them? Let's get to the harder part of the matter, and that might be H-A-D or H-E-A-R-T-E-R. I know that's not a word, but this is what I mean. How do you get along with your own family? I find that I have some of the most roughest arguments and discussions with my own blood and kin. Why that is, I'm really not sure. Jesus would say a prophet is without honor except in his own country, which basically means those who you're normally accustomed to, they tend to give you a harder time because they say they know you, they've seen your upbringing. This creates a problem. In fact, in this study, we're going to be looking at 5 different books that deal with different kind of conflicts. In Obadiah, we're talking about the conflict with relatives. When we go through the book of Philemon, we're looking at conflicts in the workplace, and you can find this on page 3. And we're going to remember this as we go through this study. These are going to be the extra lessons that we're trying to discover. Why would you make this point and then not talk about it through the lesson? A lot of these lessons don't really talk about their first emphasis. But anyways, in the book of Philemon, we're talking about conflicts in the workplace. When we get to 2 John, we're talking about conflicts between the church and culture. But then we also realize in 3 John, there are conflicts that happen within the church. How do we work with those conflicts? And then through the book of Jude, how do we work through the conflicts that are found from false teachers? We normally talk about false doctrine a lot and false teachers, but all of these are modern applications you and I can make today. In fact, whenever you look through this, it would say in the following sentence after it talks about these, the same source gives the same solution. You can find the answers of how to work through this in God's Word. Now, we either take that to the bank and deposit that check, or we sit there and leave it and say, God, you don't know what you're talking about. You see, when I look through this, I wouldn't hesitate to be one of the first people to say, I struggle in at least one of these areas. Maybe two, maybe three, maybe all five. In some capacity, I struggle with all five. But there are some who I struggle with a little bit more, and that I struggle with just a little bit more, because that's human nature. There's no such thing as a perfect individual who knows exactly how to approach all of these, except for Jesus. And it's wonderful how we can look within the book to find the solution to each and every one of these problems. So yes, our key theme throughout this whole study, the next 13 weeks, if it depended on you, can we get along with our families? Can we get along within the church? Can we get along with culture? I know that's with seasoned salt. We'll talk about that when we get to it. Can we get along in the workplace? Can we get along just in general with false teachers? By get along, how do we work through that? How do we resolve those conflicts? I know a lot of this deals with, well, you're going to have to change. But then I hear the old adage, when you point to someone and you say it's their fault, you have 4 other fingers pointing to you, or really 3 other fingers pointed to you, and 1 finger pointed to where you're going if you don't change that attitude. I might understand that it's someone else's fault, but I've also got to understand there's a maturity factor I've got to develop in working through these conflicts. Conflicts don't happen because I'm unhappy and this needs to change now. That's not how conflicts work. That's how some people presume they work. I say it, therefore it is. No, there's only one person that ever worked with, and it was God. God said it, and it was. That's the only exception. So when we go through this study, especially through Obadiah, we're going to be focusing on working with our relatives. And there's a beautiful backstory that we're going to look at as we go through the book of Obadiah. Now, before we even dive into the book, at least the workbook, let's read the whole text of Obadiah, and then I'll break down what the next 3 lessons are going to focus on in I guess we'll call it a secondary lesson that the book doesn't really hint at, but it's alluded to if we're going to focus on, if they say, it works on conflicts within our relationships. What does that look like? Well, each of these deal with a different aspect of working relationships. So let's begin by reading the text, and then I'll present to you what the next 3 lessons are going to be. The vision of Obadiah. Thus says the Lord God concerning Edom. We have heard a report from the Lord, and a messenger has been sent among the nations, saying, Arise, and let us rise up against her for battle. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You shall be greatly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you. You who dwell in the cleft of the rock, whose habitation is high, you who say in your heart, Who will bring me down to the ground? Though you ascend as high as the eagle, and though you set your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, says the Lord. If thieves have come to you, if robbers by night, how oft you would be cut off. Would they not have stolen till they had enough? If grape gatherers had come to you, would they not have left some gleaning? Oh, how Esau shall be searched out, how his hidden treasures shall be sought after. All the men in your confederacy shall force you to the border, and the men at peace with you shall deceive you and prevail against you. Those who eat your bread shall lay a trap for you. No one is aware of it. Will I not in that day, says the Lord, even destroy the wise men from Edom, and understanding from the mountains of Esau? Then your mighty men, O Teman, shall be dismayed, to the end that everyone from the mountains of Esau may be cut off by slaughter. For violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. In the day that you stood on the other side, in the day that strangers carried captive his forces, when foreigners entered his gates, and cast lots for Jerusalem, even you were as one of them. But you should not have gazed on the day of your brother in the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of distress. You should not have entered the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Indeed, you should not have gazed on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. You should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off those among them who escaped, nor should you have delivered up those among them who remained in the day of distress. For the day of the Lord upon all the nations is near. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your reprisal shall return upon your own head. For as you drank on my holy mountain, so shall all the nations drink continually. Yes, they shall drink and swallow, and they shall be as though they had never been. But on Mount Zion there shall be deliverance, and there shall be holiness. The house of Jacob shall possess their possessions, and the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame. But the house of Esau shall be stubble, and they shall kindle them and devour them, and no survivor shall remain of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. The south shall possess the mountains of Esau, and the lowland shall possess Philistia. They shall possess the fields of Ephraim and the fields of Samaria. Benjamin shall possess Gilead, and the captives of this host of the children of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites as far as Zarephath. The captives of Jerusalem who are in the Shepharet shall possess the cities of the south. Then survivors shall come to Mount Zion to judge the mountains of Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. Now that's the whole text, and we're going to break down the text in view of working with our relatives in this way. This lesson is going to focus on how being reckless with our response to our relatives causes problems. Lesson 2, we're going to focus on sometimes we remember those problems at the most inopportune or the most immature times. We'll talk about that next week, Lord willing, more often. And then lesson 3, we'll talk more about responding to problems. So even though this is focusing on the judgment of Edom, we'll focus on that textual aspect. There is a background concept that is being discussed through the history that led up to this, and then also the history that played out within the nation itself. So what we're going to focus on is how reckless behavior causes problems. It's of interest whenever we begin in the first section, a call to battle, verses 1 through 4. God calls through the prophet Obadiah, God calls the people to look, you've messed up. In fact, there's a couple of questions that arise from this. We hear the word Edom, but where does the idea of Edomites ever come from? Well, when you look at the land of Israel, this is the southern portion. The land of Edom is on the south side. If you recall back in verse 20, it uses that word in the second to last phrase, the captives of Jerusalem who are in the Shepharet. Sepharad is this actually a geographical term for, you know how we talk about there are different climates? There's tundra, there's rainforest, there's desert. Well, the land of Judah has some of those, but they have different words for it. The Shepharet is basically this desert, arid place down here toward the south that borders on the territory of Edom. It's of interest, we read about this as we go through the Old Testament. We just don't realize that's what it's being called. So our first mention of the word Edom or Edomites actually comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 36. Now in chapter 36, we read about the genealogy of Esau. So we've got to do some backtracking to understand what's the story behind Jacob and Esau. What's the family history there? What's the conflicts that arose through that story? And how did that carry over into our text that we're studying today? So if we look at Genesis chapter 36, verse 1, it just says Edom. But then if you look at verse 8 and 9, it actually gives clarity. Esau, verse 8, who is Edom. So it's another name. Now that's of interest because Jacob's name was also changed to a nation's name by the name of Israel. So now we find the beginning of the Israelites come from Jacob, and the beginning of the Edomites come from Esau. In fact, it would call him the father of the Edomites at the end of the chapter as well. So when we're talking about the Edomites, we're talking about the offspring of Esau. We're looking at the offspring of two brothers. Now let's run this down a little bit. The sons of Jacob and Esau would be considered What? Well, the sons of Jacob and the sons of Esau would be considered what in relation? Cousins. They're cousins. Now, what about the generation after that? And the one after that? And the one after that? Well, it gets kind of weird, but they're still cousins in some way. They're blood kin. They come from a common ground. In fact, if we want to trace it all the way up, they're all the offspring of Isaac and Abraham. This would be God's chosen people. However, in view of the promise seed, that seed came through the line of Jacob. We're looking at relatives of cousins. Now, what's interesting is over the period of time, we find that the family isn't quite so tight. You ever find any more, and I know she's not here, she's made this statement before, but Sandra normally talks about family get-togethers. Very, very special time. You get to see people you haven't seen in a while, and for the older generations, you get very excited because you understand there is a value in family connection. We're related, we don't get to see each other a lot. It's almost like going to see a good friend all over again. And you share that bond. You are family. What's the problem we're finding anymore today? Disconnection. Yeah. Who wants to go to a family gathering? Those are boring. Well, maybe it's because we don't appreciate family. We don't understand the value behind why families are so important. Now, there was a time where I said family get-togethers are boring until you were to talk to the grandparents, and then things got really exciting because they tell you things and do things with you that mom and dad wouldn't want you doing. And I thought it was awesome. I love hanging out with my grandma. She gave the appearance of being a brat. But when it was just me and her, man, that woman was on fire. She could get me in so much trouble, and it was awesome. I really respected her even to the day of her death about 10 years back. There's a beautiful thing in family relationships. But then we learn anymore. Is your family as close, and I'm talking about your entire family, not just your immediate family, is your family as close as it was when you were smaller? Absolutely not. So how are we to work as children of God? How are we to work not just with our extended family, but how are we to work with even our immediate family, where we can build the kind of godly families and respects, even if we can't be close to each other? Look at this. The land of Israel extends all the way up here. Who has time to go spend time with these people? Well, would they not also be amenable, the Edomites and the Israelites? Would they not be amenable to the same law? I understand the law of Moses was given to the Israelites, but could the Edomites proselytize to become Israelites? Yes, they could. What's the point of Obadiah? It's a judgment against the Edomites. Why? They're not God's people. Well, if you look back in family history, they were a part of the plan at one time, and they still are a part of the plan today. The concept is regardless of family structure, there was a falling out. In fact, it's interesting when you look at this family history, Jacob was a jerk. Not you. Jacob was a jerk. He really was. You ever play tricks on your siblings? You thought it was fun, didn't you? Yeah, I did. You can ask them all. And I got the most trouble too. But it was still fun. It was still fun. Well, Jacob did that same thing with Esau. You know how we read in chapter 25 with the birth of Jacob and Esau? How did that story play out? Well, that was later on. The actual birth of Jacob and Esau, what was the funny thing about that? Yeah, Jacob's like, no, you don't. And as Esau was coming out of the womb, Jacob's right there holding on to his leg, like, you get back here, we're not done. I don't know if it was separation anxiety or what, but there was a problem from the beginning. In fact, Esau's name, red, muddy, Edom means red clay. That's naturally what the land looks like, but that's where Esau's name comes from as well. Red, ruddy individual. Whether he had red hair or he had a red face, which we've seen people who have really red faces. I don't know. But huh? Yeah, he was very hairy, but he also had the complexion of being very red. So it was this reddish, ruddy looking character. Jacob, not so much. We might consider him the perfect medieval concept with just pale skin and smooth, ladies, the perfect lotion, whatever that might be. That's what Jacob was. And he didn't really have that much hair, which is why we find later on in chapter 27, where we find the story of Jacob fooling Isaac to take the birthright, or really to take the blessing of Isaac. Well, that was interesting. And then Esau giving up his birthright for a pot of lentils. That's not delicious, but when you're starving, yeah, Esau gave it up, and Jacob took advantage of that and said, give me your birthright, and I'll give you food. He said, okay. And later on, it came to not only bite Esau in one specific instance of his life, but it actually changed the course of how Jacob would end up pursuing his life. You have a question? Yeah, the mother didn't help in matters as well. She wanted what's best for her son, and Esau was not the one. So, and that's really one of the problems we can find from looking at Rachel, I believe, was her name. That's problematic, picking favorites with children. But I know I'm my mother's favorite. That's all that matters. Chapter 33, we find a very interesting account as well, because this is after the blessing is given. And we find with Jacob and Esau wanted to kill Jacob because of what he had done and taking the blessing from Isaac. But it's also interesting how they make resolve after a 20-year separation, because Jacob was terrified as to what Esau was going to do, and Esau was simply angry, and word just got around, and there was no resolution till 20 years later. That's where we find the Edomites. And we're going to look at that story more later on. So if we look at the Edomites, going later on through the story, Jacob and Esau may resolve, and we get later on in history. So why is God angry with the Edomites? Well, it's of interest if you look through this text. You're going to find that there was a failure to honor their request, or at least their love for their own brethren. When you read the book of Numbers chapter 20, the children of Israel are about to go into the land of Canaan, and they request for the Edomites that they allow them to just travel through there. Moses would say, we won't touch your land, your gold. We simply want to walk through here. And whoever the king of the Edomites was at that time, I don't know. You might want to read chapter 36 and read through that lineage. Very interesting to see where the kings began for Edom, but I don't really know who exactly the king would be. He denied it. In fact, Moses would use this language, your brethren Israel request that we may pass through here. Hey, cousin, I know we don't talk often, but we're kind of in a hard place. We're in a bind. Can you just we won't take anything. Can you just allow us to pass through so we don't have to go straight into the land of Canaan? Well, they denied that. In fact, the statement was, you go through this land, I'll kill you. The sword will fall on your people. And after another request or plea is made, the king comes out himself with the sword saying, you are not passing through here. So they turn around, and there's a conflict that we find later in the chapter. So it was a failure to honor the resolve that Jacob and Esau had made later in life. Well, this carried on a little bit further. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 2 and verse 4, that same account, your brethren, the Edomites, this same account comes to the second generation that's about to go into the land of Canaan, and they're told, look, they don't like us. They don't like us. For whatever reason. But again, it's probably the same reason that caused the conflict for Jacob and Esau in the first place. There was a failure to communicate and respect that connection. This led to bigger problems. So as we're going later down through the legacy of the Edomites, there's a failure to honor, look, we're blood kin, we're brethren. I'm not out to get more than you or you more than me. And again, we'll look at that text. It's interesting how that plays out with Jacob and Esau. But there's also another thing through the text that we find. Oh, and just one comment. If you see a green Q after this, that actually is one of the answers that we find in the questions. So we're actually going through those as we go through the lessons. So if you've already answered the questions, for the most part, they're all in the PowerPoint somewhere. So if you want to check that back and forth, you can do that. The second thing that they failed to do is that they failed to protect their own brethren. It's of interest in Psalm 137, verse 7, it would say that the Edomites laughed at the calamity of the Israelites going into captivity. Have you ever told someone, I'm glad that happened to you? You deserve that. You deserve everything that's coming your way. Well, that's wicked. That's wicked. Regardless of how worthy they are of that judgment. That's just evil. In fact, think of it this way. Do you think God takes any pleasure whatsoever in the death of the wicked? Absolutely not. Ezekiel 18 would tell us he does not. Well, Ezekiel 33, he doesn't delight in the death of the wicked. Do you think it delights God at all that people will be condemned to hell for all eternity? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We have to reason through in our human finite reasoning. There's no amount of wickedness you could ever do. Again, remember Romans 12:18. As much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. There was a disconnect a long, long time ago. And because of their laughing at the calamity, in fact, in Lamentations chapter 4, 21 and 22, we find the same thing. They were just jerks. Their own family from times past, again, disconnected, didn't take time to get to learn each other, even though there's a very long history with this. God says, look, I'm going to punish you for this. Now, a side note with this, and I don't have this in the text anywhere, but if you compare Obadiah 1 with Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 7 through 22, it's almost the same text, just in a different order. And I'm not sure whether or not Obadiah just copied something from Jeremiah, or if Obadiah was the originator of the oracle. I don't know. But they're very similar if you compare them. But it says the same thing. Why did you laugh at your brother in the day of his calamity? It's almost as if we go back to the very first brotherly problem. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, as a matter of fact, yes. Yes, you are. Now, let's think in the ultimate aspect before we get to what this problem really came down to. Why would it be said whenever God asked Cain, where is your brother Abel? Then he gives that question, am I my brother's keeper? If God were to ask the Edomites, where is your brother Israel? And he were to ask that same question, am I my brother's keeper? What's the violation concept? You know, Abel was this just as much as Cain was this in view of God. You're like this as much as anybody else in the world is toward God. The answer is we're all made in God's image. Yes, I do have a responsibility as a child of God to save myself, but I also have a responsibility because the one who made all things came down to save you and I. I have a responsibility to try my best, as much as depends on me, to save their soul. Ain't got time for silly arguments. What? Ain't got time for silly arguments. If a 20-year feud of disconnect ruined the connection between a brother and a brother, and then it separated him from more than that. It ruined from seeing certain family members and spending time with each other and building a nation together and spending time with his father and with his mother growing up. Yes, it does sting if you miss time in life. You ever talk to someone who's been in prison and missed out on what they would say the prime years of their life, or missed their children grow up, or miss their family grow up? Any kind of separation whatsoever in view of our relationships with one another has a very costly cost. The Edomites had a problem with this. And they said, no, we're not our brother's keeper. Really, when you think about it, this is a pride problem. This is a pride problem. All of this is a pride problem. So as we go beyond this initial call to battle, God says, I'm going to punish you, Edom, because you got a pride issue. You were supposed to be there, and you weren't. And it was a failure to remember who they were and where they came from. So as we continue in the second section, and we look at the opponents of Edom, there were three things that were fighting against them. They trusted in their geographical home terrain. This is my home, you have your own, just deal with it. And sometimes we have that attitude in view of sinners. Well, we taught them, they know better, so they'll just deal with it. How'd that work out for the Edomites? Well, they were destroyed later on. But they trusted in their home terrain. Some of them trusted in their physical things a little bit too much. And some of them even trusted in false allies. You see in verse 7, it would talk about your allies are going to turn against you. Your companions, your compatriots are going to turn against you. You ever trusted in someone and you said, oh, they're my friend, but in reality, no, they weren't. In fact, there was no connection whatsoever. Sometimes we build this idea of false friends. Facebook is a huge, huge advocate for that. And what I mean by that is oftentimes people say they have a ton of friends or they have a ton of followers, but all they have are acquaintances. Those aren't necessarily friends. Friends are people who know you. Jesus said, now I call you friends because you do what I ask you. What did that take for Jesus and the apostles? They had to spend time with one another. They had to get acquainted with one another. They had to know their weaknesses and their strengths, and they had to work together to build on each of those. It's of interest, we find at the bottom of page 5, God knows every hiding place man might consider. No individual or nation is beyond his reach. It's of interest that God knows the best hiding places, but it's also of interest that we can know the best hiding places as well. But my best hiding place, if I come up with it, there's no such thing as hide and seek with God. I know we see that account in Genesis 3 where Adam and Eve are hiding and God's walking through the garden. But did God know where Adam and Eve was? Absolutely. Now, in a simple game of hide and seek, think about the thoughts of your heart, the actions of your past, the actions of your present. Do you honestly think we can hide those things from God? Absolutely not. But you see, if I figure out the right things to hide in the right places, lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust doth corrupt and thieves break through and steal, but lay up your treasures in heaven where moth and rust does not corrupt. And thieves cannot break through and steal. There is a proper place for the things that we have. When we put them in the proper place, then we'll get the proper results. It's of interest in Psalm 139, I believe it's about verse 6 and following, maybe later on in the text. The psalmist would say, Lord, where can I go and you're not there? If I go to the highest place on earth, you're there. If I go to the lowest place on earth, it would say Sheol or hell, you're there. You see my every being. Even before I came into this world, you knew me. Now that's beautiful, and we'll talk about that here in a moment, why that is. But also there's another thought that comes in mind. Do I tend to have a problem? And the problem here is trust problems. You ever find yourself blaming people rather than trying to understand people? It's much easier for me to blame people for things than it is for me to try to contemplate, why are you doing this? And even ask them. I know it might get heated, but just ask them. Why are you doing this? If you think about the turmoil that Jacob caused early on between him and Esau, and yes, part of it was Jacob's fault, part of it was Esau's fault, but at the end of the day, who cares? They lost 20 years of relationship with one another. Think about the person who says, I don't care about your soul. I don't want to talk to you ever again. 20 years is nothing in comparison to eternity. Nothing in comparison. I may have trust issues with the world, but I still have an obligation to reach out to them. Let's bring it closer than the world. I may have trust issues with some people in my family. And there's a certain wisdom involved with how you handle people. But at the same time, trust problems are not an excuse to void me from my obligation to go into all of my family and teach the gospel. I got to figure out how to work through those trust problems. But there's also another problem we find. You see, the last thing we find in Edom's destruction, Edom was unstoppable. They had this idea, who can touch me? You ever heard of someone say, No one can take me down. No one can destroy me. I'm on the top of the world. I'm indestructible. Young people seem to think this, and unfortunately, very few are, well, we're all young in view of eternity. But why do we ever think that? You know, it would say in the text that God would destroy the wise men of Edom. In fact, he would destroy the mightiest men of Edom. In fact, it would say that God would take all that Edom had. Now, if God can take everything that I have, my intellect, my strength, my life, if God can take that, what's that process called? If God doesn't take me out of this world, but he takes the things of the world out of my life. Being humbled. Being humbled. God's telling Edom in a very roundabout way, look, you have a heart problem. You need to be humbled. In fact, the New Testament over and over, it's interesting in the Proverbs, you read oftentimes, we normally use the adage, pride comes before a fall. That's not the full verse. It would say pride comes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. In fact, where there is pride, there's foolishness. But where there's humility, there is honor. It's of interest, the proverb writer would later on say that where there's honor, there's humility. You find someone who's in a very decorated position, they might have some bad antics about how exactly they got there, but I guarantee they've humbled themselves to some kind of rule and regulation. They had to. There's no such thing as just cheating your way through something. Now, I know some people use false gains and false means and sucker up to people in order to get certain things in life. But really, in view of Edom, they had a heart problem. You think you can get away with this? Now, how does that relate to family relationships? Well, it's of interest going back to the initial statement. Conflict happens. Sometimes it's our fault. Sometimes it's not. But I want you to notice what Edom had to go through. They had pride issues. They had trust issues. Ultimately, it was a heart issue. But it's of interest when we compare Edom and Israel. Offspring of Esau, offspring of Jacob. Really, if you think about it, it's really a connection between what about your family and you? Is there a disconnect? Is there a falling out? Have we just kind of let bygones be bygones and said, well, I'm just not going to deal with it? You do know the golden rule is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. The hardest neighbors to love are the ones who are right next door. The harder neighbors to love are the ones within your doors. You tend to find it harder to convert your family. You know how often the Bible speaks about in Galatians chapter 5, Romans 13, James chapter 2 talks about the loyal or the royal law of liberty. Using not our liberty, it would say in Galatians 5, using not our liberty for an occasion for the flesh, but rather fulfilling the law of love, making sacrifices where needed, straining and going towards goals that seem impossible because I get too heated with other people. So here are the three things that I want us to focus on when we go through this study. Number one, I need you to ask yourself, how is all of your family? Do you know? If you don't, you might need to change some things. God didn't call us here to be selfish. He called us here to be selfless. Number two, how's your response been to them? If your response is no response at all, that's not what I saw Jesus do. He came from heaven to earth to save you. What's the least we can do to save our family? And then number three, how are you handling their soul's present state? Again, we may not agree, we may not have been able to see eye to eye, but at the same time, Romans chapter 12, verse 18, if it is possible, as much as depends on you, if God were to talk to you today and say, you were the one to lead them to heaven, how are you doing on that? I've failed in many ways, in asking those questions. But there are some victories in there. Don't get me wrong, there are some victories. But the more I continue to examine that, maybe I spend a little bit too much time on the I, not enough time on them. We've got to put values in the right place, put them in the proper placement at the right time. I love God, don't get me wrong. I love my family too, but I don't just want to say it. I want to be able to show it. Are they constantly on your mind? Does God hear them frequently in your prayers? Does God even know that you think of them often? Does God also know you can't hide anything from Him? Does God also know you don't care and you'll laugh at the day of their calamity? Now, reckless problems. Jacob caused some problems. Esau caused some problems. But as we're going to see throughout this text, we're going to reflect back on Genesis 33. We're going to see how exactly Jacob and Esau made a reconnection. We're going to look at the different attitudes that were involved with this, because there are things that have to happen on both sides, but at the same time, it should never be said of God's child, I never tried anything to make amends. We're not here just to glorify God. We're here to bring people to God as well. Don't be found on Judgment Day being victim of not caring for your family. Lord willing, next week we're going to look into chapter 2, Edom's history. So we're going to look more back through the book of Kings, Chronicles, and some of the things we find through the prophets. So go ahead, read through that text. We'll talk about some more concepts, more so in dealing with how do we reflect on problems of the past and resolve them in view of the future. I hope this way of studying the book kind of helps make the book breathe a little bit more. But go back, listen to the study if you can on Facebook or YouTube, or just read the text. Really read the biblical text. There's a whole lot of things we don't talk about, but they're in the biblical text, and they're just beautiful. Last statement. I made a post on Facebook last night because I was reading through this. Luke chapter 15. We find the story of the prodigal son, and we always talk about how the father was weeping and he ran to the son and said, Son, I'm so happy you're here. But we never talk about the story of the lost brother who came home to his brother. And his brother did the same thing the father did. Do we not think that when Jesus was teaching in Luke 15, that it reminded them of what they read from Genesis? Of Esau, a brother running to his brother? I think there's a beautiful picture there, and we'll talk more about that later on through this study. Thank you for your time and your attention.